University West is for a few days now hosting an international conference, Vilär, and it's focused on our profile, work integrated learning. So it's a great opportunity to learn from other researchers and exchange knowledge. So I have the opportunity to speak a little with the three keynote speakers. So today now I have Lorna Unwin here, professor. Most welcome.
Thank you.
Nice having you here.
Thank you.
And we would like to have a little glimpse of your keynote speech for those who have not the possibility to attend. So if you can, in the short version, describe a little bit about what you're going to talk about.
Okay. Yes. What I'm going to focus on is really a set of questions around why it is that workplaces organise themselves very differently in terms of their capacity to enable people to both develop and utilise their expertise. And the reason I want to focus on that here at this conference is because I think those of us who are involved in trying to organise and manage forms of work-related or work-integrated learning, we need to think very carefully, obviously, about what's happening in the workplace in terms of changes, technological changes particularly, and the impact of that on the learning that we want students to engage in. But we also have to think about it in terms of if part of our work-related, work-integrated learning programmes have work placements, then what are these work environments like that we're sending students into? And so I want to really pose a set of questions about how we start to analyse workplaces as learning environments. Because I think by analysing the characteristics of different workplaces, we can perhaps more effectively both prepare our students who are going to enter those workplaces, but also work with those workplaces to think about how they might develop what I and a research colleague in England refer to as expansive learning environments.
Mm-hmm. I read about you a bit before, and you talk quite a lot about mutual understanding as a key element, as
Yes.
I interpret it.
Yes.
Can you develop that a bit?
Say something about that?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think there's long been a kind of simplistic assumption that in work-related, work-integrated learning, that as long as a student or an apprentice or whatever has some immersion in a workplace, then that's good. That's fine.
Good enough.
That's okay. And I think that's partly based on the assumption that all workplaces are more or less the same. When actually, when you research those workplaces, you find that they're incredibly different, and of course that means students have very different experiences, even within the same occupational fields, the same economic sectors. So if it's healthcare, for example, students in one workplace in healthcare will have a very different experience to another one. Same in engineering, administration. And so that's, for me, that's really interesting. And so when you look at workplaces, what you find is that obviously they differ in terms of the experience that workplace has had in thinking itself about workforce development. And so the idea about mutual learning is that I think the education and training organisation, whether it's a university, college, whatever, needs to have a relationship with the employer that is much more sophisticated than saying, will you take this student of ours for X number of weeks or months? It has to be much more sophisticated, and I think it has to be based around a mutual understanding of what each party understands about learning and what its expectations are.
It sounds like a huge task to be able to get this working in a big scale, if you have to really, really get to learn the workplace. I mean, is it possible?
Well, I think it is possible. I think I think what you need are analytical tools to do it. I think you need a set of principles around how, and I think particularly from the side of education, so those of us who work in education, I think we have to operate from a set of principles or a set of ideas about how workplaces are constituted. And so we have to, for example, think carefully about a workplace in terms of, for example, how much time will managers have to support our students? And particularly, what are the pressures that that workplace is under? Are they pressures caused by the types of goods and services they produce in terms of the product market that they work in? Are the pressures based around being that workplace is part of quite a complicated system where a lot of power is being exerted on the workplace externally rather than internally, those sorts of things. And you can quickly get a sense of that by talking to people in the workplace, but also thinking about where that workplace sits within an organisation. How autonomous is it? And you can design an analytical tool to do that. And
of course you can see the value you can get from this.
Yes.
Of course.
Yes.
If you have more insight into each other's worlds, so to speak.
Yes. And I think what that helps us as educators to understand that some workplaces, which initially seem to not particularly create the conditions to give a student a good experience, in some cases it's not because they're bad workplaces or the people in them are not trying hard enough. It's simply because they haven't really understood what it is that's expected. Or they're actually very new to thinking about how you encourage somebody who's in that dual function of being both a student and an employee. I mean, they're not an employee legally necessarily, but they're playing the role of an employee. But they've got this dual identity. How do you support them? And conversations can really help to enable that workplace to think about that, perhaps for the first time.
You can really see the use of it.
Yeah.
So very shortly, how come you're interested in this field?
I think it began as a child. I come from a family in the north of England where everybody worked. So, both the men and the women at all sorts of different jobs. People worked in factories, people worked in shops, some people were cooks, etc., etc. And I was always used to people talking about their work. And as a child, I became quite interested in the differences between the jobs that my relatives did. And because I lived in Manchester, which when I was a child was a major manufacturing city, I used to visit factories because factories in those days used to have Christmas parties for their staff and children and so on. And I became very interested in manufacturing and the processes and so on. And then I originally, after leaving school, I trained as a journalist and worked as a journalist for a little while on weekly newspapers in the north of England. And again, I would visit and I would interview people from all different working backgrounds. I became very interested in that. Then I trained as a teacher to teach in what in England are called further education colleges. And so again, I taught apprentices, I taught students on work-related learning programmes. And then I thought I'd like to research this. And I moved into being an academic in universities and began to research the whole field of how people develop their skills, their expertise in different settings, and why it is that some people are able to develop to their full potential and, as importantly, are able to utilise their expertise, whereas other people are not. And I think, certainly in the UK, and I think this is probably true for many countries, we underutilise people's expertise. And that's, I think, often because workplaces, for all sorts of reasons, don't really know how to use people properly and develop their skills. And I would add that I think some of the, and this perhaps is a controversial thing to say, some of the worst workplace learning environments are actually in educational institutions.
That is a bit controversial, maybe.
Well, it's ironic, but I think it's because many educational institutions, schools, colleges, universities, don't see themselves as workplaces. They see themselves as places where people come to learn, but they don't really think of themselves as workplaces. So a lot of people who work in educational institutions will often grumble about the nature of the workplace.
Okay. I see.
So I think that's a challenge.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Exciting because we at our department, the communication department, are soon having a co-op student, a cooperative education student. So I have to bear this in mind. But we are a workplace.
We are a workplace.
We have to act like one.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I think I'll stop there.
Oh, right.
Thank you very much for getting this glimpse of your research.
Oh, no.
And wish you a very good conference.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, it's a real privilege to be here, and I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot. So thank you.
I hope so. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.